Hello, health psychology peeps. This is part one of the obesity lecture about to start. I hope everybody has been safe and healthy out there. I know the stress is starting to get to people and the quarantine might be starting to get to people. Today we are covering obesity. All right. So the word obesity literally means to overeat, but as we're going to see throughout the lecture, it's a little more complicated than just overeating because sedentary lifestyle is going to be quite the culprit here. One of the easiest ways that we measure obesity is through body mass index, and body mass index is our weight in kilograms over our height in meters squared. There's certainly some problems with BMI because it doesn't take into account how much muscle you have. But let's take a look at how we define obesity. In terms of BMI, this is the Center for Disease Control levels and cutoffs for BMI and what they consider to be overweight, obese, and what they would consider to be extreme or morbid obesity. I want you to know that there's some controversy about these cutoff scores. So Center for Disease Control considers BMI 25 overweight, 30 is obese, and 40 is extreme or morbid obesity. But I want you to take a look at the little figurines over here to the right. Where our body genetically likes to store body fat also has implications for our health. The apple shape, which is called android, and if you think about android kind of associated with manliness, men are a lot more likely to store their body fat above their waistline, and some women store their body fat above their waistline. The android or the apple shape is much more dangerous in terms of our health than the pear shape, which would be the woman on the far right. And a lot of women who store their body fat this way would be storing body fat below the waist. And so one of the metrics that we take a look at in terms of trying to predict illness or predict health is that waist to hip ratio. So if a person has a waist that is larger than their hips, their waist to hip ratio is going to be above 1, and that is the thing that is dangerous. A waist that is smaller than hips, a person's going to have a waist to hip ratio less than 1. And that seems to be protective. And again, some women tend to have that. Some men do too. But below 1 is safer. There is a new metric that is being used by epidemiologists that seems like it has even a cleaner, better predictor of illness or health. And that is waist to height ratio. So waist to height ratio seems like it is more precise for predicting illness. Okay, we talked about the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey when we covered nutrition. And so this is some of the data. This is that surveillance survey where they survey people in the US in representative samples on a regular basis. Right now, 17% of US children and teens are overweight. About 30% of adults would be classified as overweight according to Center for Disease Control. 32% of adults would be considered obese. We have seen in the last 30 years, men indeed are eating more per day, and women especially are eating more per day. And that's part of the explanation for why we're seeing increasing obesity prevalence. But a lot of that has to do with sedentary lifestyle also. Trends in prevalence, let me show you. You can look at that link if you would like, but the states, over top left, 1990, we had a lot less individuals in the United States that were obese. By 1999, you see a changing pattern, and then check out 2008. And this trend is continuing, and you'll see, if you look kind of deep south, we see quite a bit of obesity in the deeper south here. In terms of linking level of body size to morbidity, illness, as well as linking it to mortality, death, we see this J-shaped curve. And I'm going to show you a slide here in a minute where we're really going to emphasize this J-shaped curve and what it means. But we know that obesity is associated with a lot of different kinds of illness. So hypertension, high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, we covered that when we covered the diabetes lecture. Arthritis, gout, gallbladder disease, sleep apnea, which is difficulty breathing and really poor quality sleep at night, fatty liver, surgical complications, and it's also related to the leading causes of death. So remember, number one is heart disease, usually heart attacks or myocardial infarction. Number two is cancer in the United States, and number three are cerebrovascular accidents or stroke. And obesity is associated with all three of those. And when we cover cancer, we'll talk a little bit more about what is going on with that, but certainly different types of cancers are associated. Okay, this is Journal of American Medical Association. There's a lot of data on these slides for us to absorb, but what I want you paying attention to is this J-shaped curve in associations with BMI. And if you take a look, we're going to just start with this one over here on the left. There are different age groups in here is what they've got people classified according to. If you look at the 18 to 25, that which is considered to be normal weight, and you look further left at 18.5, 18.5 and below is considered to be underweight. And what you see there is that there are more deaths in the underweight category than in the normal weight category. And if we break that down, there are a couple of different things happening. Certainly, we've got some individuals who are dying because they have the psychological disorder anorexia, and they are dying of malnutrition because of anorexia. But I also want us thinking through a bit what happens to a lot of individuals when they have chronic illness and they start deteriorating. A lot of people get this emaciation, this body wasting, and a lot of individuals lose a dramatic amount of weight prior to their death. So there's some of that happening. And now let's go over and let's take a look at BMI of 30, which the Center for Disease Control considers to be obese. You start to see once an individual is classified as obese at 30 and 35, you start to see an acceleration of the death rate. So that would be on the right side of the J curve there. So indeed, once an individual is classified as obese and above, that is associated with an acceleration of death rates. Not for everybody who falls in those categories, but on average, you see an acceleration of risk. What I want you to pay attention to here, this is an interesting phenomenon that gets ignored a lot in the media, particularly media reporting about fear and stigma and poor health associated with obesity. BMI of 25 to 30, the Center for Disease Control would consider that to be overweight. But when you look at this data here, you actually see those classified as overweight at lower risk for mortality. So I'm gonna flip some slides here and show you that we see this across age groups. These are J-shaped curves in same research study for men. And then this is a slide on women. We see this thing over and over again, that overweight, according to our culture and our society and the media and what a lot of experts in healthcare believe, thinking overweight is dangerous for us, but it actually looks, when you look at these epidemiological studies and you look at these J-shaped curves, it actually seems to be protective for us. So when I talk about that J-shaped curve, that is what I'm talking about, but I want you to mentally note that overweight actually seems to be at less risk. And so that kind of brings up the issue of, should the Center for Disease Control be changing the names of how they classify these types of things? I also want us kind of focusing on the fact that, so CDC might be needing to change their names for this stuff. So should we be calling that normal weight or healthy weight would be classified at 25. Oh, the other thing is a lot of healthcare individuals believe that overweight is like the gateway, you know, like gateway drug, that type of thing, that overweight is the gateway into obesity. But a lot of people, wherever their weight is, it's rather stable for them. And a stable weight is healthier than a weight that is dramatically increasing or a weight that is dramatically decreasing. And so maybe it's not the gateway for a lot of individuals. Okay, so I showed you the US map. We are seeing, we're at an all-time prevalence of obesity in the United States, and the cost is expected to increase substantially due to health consequences, and probably, you know, we talked about the 3 leading causes of death, but also for individuals who are sedentary. Obesity is driving up that type 2 diabetes, like we talked about in that diabetes lecture. We also see for women, obesity is associated with pregnancy complications. Like we talked about in the the diabetes lecture, women get screened if they have access to healthcare when they're pregnant. And we see higher rates of gestational diabetes during pregnancy, and those are considered to be high risk pregnancies for women. Women during pregnancy are more likely to get this condition called preeclampsia, or this is also called toxemia. For those of you who are Downton Abbey fans, there was a case of toxemia and the death of a mom, a baby who lived, but a mom who died in Downton Abbey. And this is a condition for women where they build up, it's almost like their bodies are allergic to the genetic aspect of their babies, and their bodies overreact kind of in that reaction. And women get high blood pressure, they can get really intensive headaches, and they can have seizures and die because of this condition. Women are more likely to need cesarean sections in delivering their baby when they are obese. And babies of obese mothers have an increased risk of neural tube defects. Oftentimes we call that spina bifida. More at risk for having stillbirth, so a baby that is born who is not alive, very, very sad. More likely to have premature births, and babies that are large for gestational age. Remember, we've talked about typical baby size in the US is about 7.5 pounds. These women are more likely to have babies that are 9 pounds or above, and having delivered babies that were not nearly that big many, many moons ago, I say ouch on that. All right. So metabolic syndrome, we've talked a little bit about this when we talked about diabetes in this class. If individuals have a large waistline, and so right here they're talking about a waistline of 40 inches or above for men, 35 or above for women, that's going to put them at risk, because a lot of that is reflecting that android obesity. So a waist that is larger than hips is a signal that there's more fat stored in the abdominal area. And I didn't mention earlier, but I'll mention it now. Visceral fat, so fat that is stored inside the abdomen, is the absolute most dangerous body fat, because it is putting pressure on the internal organs. For an individual that's, even if they store fat in their abdomen, if it's exterior, so it kind of hangs over in their belly, that is safer than visceral fat. So I want you to kind of picture like a fella that you would consider to have a beer gut, who almost looks like they are pregnant. That's the most dangerous. If it's just larger fat in the waistline, that is kind of more muffin top type thing, that is less dangerous. One of the ways, there's some really interesting research. We've done a little bit of this in our lab in the past, research where they look at companies that require uniforms, and you can predict with uniform size who is at risk for health issues with the larger uniform sizes than the smaller uniform sizes, just based on that, because uniform size is tapping into that large waistline. We've done some research in my lab where we've looked at clothing size. For men, that's usually pant size, which is usually waist size. For women, it's usually dress size. And we've done some interesting body image research where we've actually asked people their clothing size and what their ideal clothing size is. And that discrepancy between where people are, if there is a discrepancy between their current clothing size and their ideal clothing size, that metric serves as a really nice predictor of body image dissatisfaction. So we've done a little bit of that in my lab. Having high triglycerides, which are blood fats, having low levels of the HDL, the high density lipoprotein, the so-called good cholesterol. Remember, that's the one we want to be higher. Having high blood pressure or needing to be on blood pressure medication. Having high fasting blood glucose levels, which is that symptom for type 2 diabetes. So a person that has this metabolic syndrome is twice as likely to be at risk for coronary heart disease, 5 times the risk for type 2 diabetes. And it's estimated that about 27% of people in the US have this metabolic syndrome. Part of the reason why this syndrome got a name is a little bit later in this lecture, I'm going to talk about controversy associated with body size and fat stigma and that type of thing. Metabolic syndrome is a true disease. And there are a lot of people that have issues, and I'll talk about this again in a bit, calling obesity a disease when obesity is a body size and cutoffs. I've already told you, excuse me, that CDC, there's controversy about those BMI cutoffs. And so because of that, metabolic syndrome as a disease can be used as a diagnosis. And so doctors can diagnose metabolic syndrome without necessarily diagnosing obesity as a disease, and then can offer up treatments to help people treat metabolic syndrome. Another thing I want you to acknowledge is that for people, once they develop metabolic syndrome, it makes it really easy for them to keep gaining weight. And so what this tells to me, and I've used this as a healthcare provider, I have worked with individuals who are quite large before, who will say it is so hard for them to control their weight, that they gain weight at the drop of a dime type of thing, that when they have tried exercising or cutting back on their food and cutting back on their calories, that it's really hard for them to lose weight. And then that feeds into some of the fat stigma. But it is real, people. It is real for these individuals. Once they have metabolic syndrome, it becomes much easier for them to keep gaining weight, much harder for them to lose weight. And that has implications for us and our compassion with these individuals as healthcare providers. Okay, so I'm going to move on. All right, I want to spend some time on this controversy because I have done myself, I have been at conferences where this controversy is happening. I have wrestled with this and feel like I have found some enlightenment in my own career with this. And I have written about this. I have researched and written about this in some of my work in the past. So let's focus first of all on the left side of the screen. The left side of the screen is where most lay people, so just normal people, citizens in our culture, people feel. They feel this and they believe this, and a lot of healthcare providers believe this. And on the left side, this side of the controversy, is where a lot of scientists, a lot of the medical model is, a lot of the media framing, and these people believe overweight and obesity is always unhealthy. It is unhealthy, and therefore we need to take people who are obese especially, and we need to help them lose weight in order for them to get healthy. Then there's that overweight idea, this idea that overweight is the gateway to obesity and that overweight is dangerous. And so we need to help overweight people get lean so that, you know, as a risk factor, gateway, that these overweight people don't grow into obesity and then they're going to have all of these health problems. And so it's this idea that overweight and obesity is always unhealthy. We need to help these people lose weight in order for them to get healthy. Well, just reflect back on that Journal of American Medical Association data that I showed you a little bit ago. That J-shaped curve does not speak to that, does it? It actually speaks to the fact that it looks like being 25 BMI in that category is actually protective. Okay, so that's side one. That is the most common belief system for people in the United States, even including a lot of scientists and a lot of healthcare workers. Okay, let's go over here to side two. There are several organizations, you can look deeper into this if you would like, that very strongly believe that that is not true, that side one has got it wrong, okay? And the organization's Fat Acceptance Movement, and I would like to just right now say that people who are a part of the Fat Acceptance Movement, they like the word fat. They feel like in some ways they have reclaimed the word fat, a bit like African Americans have reclaimed, oftentimes in culture, the N word. So an example would be rap music by an African American, where they're using that word as a term of endearment, and reclaiming it so that it doesn't have the horrible connotations that it can be associated with that. There's also health at every size, and these people call themselves HAES, Health at Every Size movement. And it's simply the idea that people can be, and this really is true, you can be healthy at every size in terms of BMI categorization. So fat acceptance movement. Fat acceptance movement, people say that fat is beautiful in other cultures. We've just got particular stigma and issues and discrimination against fat here in the United States. They also point out that across even US history, across time, we've had different, what we consider to be different role models for beauty. And oftentimes seeing individuals with larger bodies as being the ideal, as opposed to individuals with leaner bodies. People on the right side, side two, also say that the data is actually quite complicated, that if you have to dig deeper into the epidemiological data to understand this, and that the risks of overweight are indeed overrated. Go back to that J-shaped curve. Only morbid obesity is unhealthy. And then they say, hey, look, side one says you've got to lose weight to be healthy. Side two says, hey, nothing's worked. That in fact, we know from animal models and from human models that the more people yo-yo diet, okay, yo-yo would meaning being larger, dieting, losing weight, allowed to not diet anymore and regain weight over and over. We've even seen this in mice models, animal models, where you take mice and you starve them, they lose weight, they end up heavier after they've been allowed to eat normally. You diet them again, starve them again, and you allow them to eat normally. Those mice end up being much, much higher in body fat after the yo-yo dieting. Same thing happens to human beings. And so, and I can add to this because you all know that I do a lot of research on fat talk and body image. Body image with yo-yo dieting tends to get worse and worse for people. Psychologically, it is not good for them. They end up feeling like a failure. If they've lost weight and regained weight, they end up with larger body size and feeling oftentimes worse about their body image. And so it just simply hasn't worked. We have not been very good, especially with lifestyle change, at helping people lose weight and keep it off. I'll talk more about that later. Add to that, there is a tremendous amount of stigma in United States culture associated with very large body sizes. It is a prejudice that we actually see in children as young as 3 and 4 in the United States. And it is an interesting prejudice because it's one thing to have prejudice against groups of other people, but then there's this thing called self-stigma. We sometimes see self-stigma related to mental health as an example, where people feel like they've got some stigma about people with mental health issues, but even in their own, if they've got mental health issues, they will feel some self-stigma. We see this self-stigma even in people with larger body sizes. So it's a really sad kind of thing for me to think about as a clinician and a scientist, that even individuals with larger bodies oftentimes hold these stereotypes that obese people are lazy and gluttonous and they're going to eat all your food. And that's just really sad to me. Okay. And then acknowledging fat is beautiful in other cultures. Now, I've talked about these two sides, and I just want you to know that these two sides continue to fight. I've been at conferences where there are people representing these two groups, and they are still going at it. They're going at it in studies, they're going at it in publications in the literature, and they go at it in person. And so I'll keep talking about this a little bit. I do want you to know about health at every size. I feel like I have embraced health at every size in my clinical work and in my research. I follow a group on Facebook. I find it fascinating. I just do a lot of lurking in this group. I don't do much posting. But I find it fascinating how often individuals have joined the HAES group and believe in this philosophy. And there are books you look up if you want to read more about this. But on my Facebook following that I thought, how many of these individuals are complaining about their healthcare providers not respecting their body size? So an example would be going into their medical doctor because they've got strep throat, their kid had strep throat, they've got strep throat now, and their healthcare provider wants to sit down and talk with them and is worried about them because of their body size and their health when they've gone in for something else. And so the idea that healthcare providers are linking everything that could ail a person and attributing it causally to that individual's body size, I get why that doesn't feel good for these individuals. Another thing that I see a lot of on the Hayes Facebook posts, and it never really occurred to me because I've been going to medical doctors all my life. One of the things that happens when you first go in, you get weighed. Then after that, oftentimes they'll take your temperature if you're at risk for infection, they'll take your blood pressure. Those things are easy to take. Just because they're easy to take, they have become habitual and they have become routine. It makes a little sense to me that oftentimes doctors need to know our body size to be able to, if we're going to need a prescription, if we're going to need medication, to dose our medication. But you know what? Most doctors, they can kind of gauge body size and know what level of medication you need without knowing your precise weight. So a lot of these people who are posting on Facebook on Hayes are saying things like, I have asked when I go into a doctor's office that I not be weighed. And you know what? Most of them say that the nurses who take them, that they're fine with that. They're respectful of that. There's no need for that. And if you know that for some individuals being weighed, if they have an eating disorder, regardless of where their weight is, if they have larger body sizes and they are victims of being stigmatized and discriminated against on a regular basis, that number can be very triggering for them. So, it is possible to go into a doctor's office and say, hey, I don't want to be weighed today. And a lot of healthcare providers will respect that. So interesting stuff. I want to talk a little bit about Abigail Skye. She's written a wonderful book. I've read this book. I've actually written and published a book review of her work. And she's a sociology professor and a gender studies professor at UCLA. And her book's called What's Wrong with Fat? And she approaches this very much from like a media framing perspective. But there are she gives a couple of personal anecdotes in her book. It's chock full. I mean, it's a very scholarly book full of her scouring scientific literature. But two personal anecdotes rang home to me about what she was going through as she was researching and writing this book. One story she has is that she, as she's researching this book, and she reports in the book that she considers herself to be a person of lean privilege. And I have like adopted this way of thinking about this over time, that I certainly have white privilege. I certainly have educational privilege, and I have realized that I have lean privilege also, that I walk around in this world and I do not experience fat stigma as a human being. And she reports that in her research, she went to a conference, a fat acceptance movement and a Hayes conference, and she was pregnant at the time. And before she left and got on her flight and went out to this conference, she was feeling, I hate this term, feeling fat. I address this when I work with clients because there's no such thing as a feeling that is called fat. But she was feeling fat and feeling large because she was pregnant and had a baby in there. And on her way to the conference, she was feeling big and feeling fat. After going to this conference and interacting with all of these people with larger bodies, as on her ride home and her flight home, she said, I feel like I've got this mosquito bump on my belly, and realizing how small her body size really was because she'd been interacting with all these people who are very large. Another anecdote kind of thing that she spoke about while she was at this conference around all these larger people, and had this kind of aha moment that she went out to the conference hotel pool just to relax one day and just enjoy the sunshine at the conference. And that there were these men who had deliberately come to this conference hotel and to this pool area, and that these men were there because they wanted to meet women with really larger bodies because they were fat lovers. They wanted to pick up and meet women and perhaps form relationships, perhaps just like hook up with these larger women. And so she said she had this image kind of burned in her brain of this muscular fella sitting at the side of the pool with this larger woman body sitting on his lap, and they were, you know, just flirting and kissing and enjoying one another. And she said that really kind of hit home, realizing that, okay, what's wrong with fat? And then just kind of acknowledging that there are people out there that really are attracted to and really dig fat bodies. This is a research study by Viren Swamy. He is a body image researcher. He has edited some of my studies and my work in the past. And what we've got here are, you see in the, I guess this is aqua colored, men who usually are attracted to women, heterosexual men that are attracted to women who like what we would consider to be leaner body sizes. And you see that as BMI increases for them, they tend to find women to be less attractive. But let's flip over and look at this kind of this, I guess, beigey orange color. These are men that consider themselves to be fat admirers. And the fat admirers, what you see is that their peak attraction for women starts to really increase at 25, and it keeps going for a lot of them. These men really are sexually and emotionally attracted to women with larger body sizes. And so the fat admirers, they don't like the women who are lean. They want some babies got back in their attraction. Oh no, I'm gonna have that song on my head all day. Okay, next slide. Hey, do we know this person? Do we know this person who wrote this book, this 2-year labor of love, me producing this book called Fat Talk? I have a whole chapter. I told you I had done research on this. A whole chapter is one of my favorite chapters to research and to write. And it's called Invasion of Body Snarking. And so we've talked a little bit about fat talk. Fat talk's when women complain about their own level of body fat, or they complain about their own appearance, oftentimes with family members or other women. And so fat talk's really about ourselves, okay? And it's an unhealthy thing, and I've researched and written about that. Body snarking, which is also called fat shaming and weight teasing, is when people make fun of and snark or shame or tease or stigmatize other individuals because of their body size. And fat shaming and weight teasing is alive and well in our culture, and it is horrible. When you actually look at the data associated with this, being a victim of this is very dangerous, and it's quite pernicious. It's quite common in US culture. And we have seen that the fat shaming, whether it comes from a partner, whether it comes from a sibling, whether it comes from a parent, especially bad if it comes from two parents. It is bad if it comes from a troll anonymously on the media. It is bad if it comes somebody known on social media. It is bad for people who are victims of this. I do some of my research is on interpersonal violence and bullying, and I consider this to be one of the most horrible forms of bullying that people can be a victim of. And so I have a lot of sympathy for individuals who have been stigmatized and fat shamed. There is a wonderful article that I have researched and I've written about, and it's just simply called If Fat Shaming Worked, meaning if fat shaming worked in helping larger bodied size people feel bad about themselves, want to lose weight, effectively lose weight. If it worked, there would be no fat people, because the fat shaming and the fat stigma is so pernicious. It is so ubiquitous. It is so common in US culture. If it worked, there would be no fat people. People would feel so bad. They would do what they did, you know, what they could to lose weight. Keep in mind, that doesn't work very well. So one of the researchers that I've done a lot of my own personal research and I've gathered and written about her work is Rebecca Pohl, and she is up at Yale, and she has done some fascinating research to kind of break this stuff apart. And she's actually found in a recent publication, this was American Psychologist in 2020, so hot off the press in terms of science, that being a victim of weight stigma does not encourage and predict effective weight loss and improved health. In fact, what she has found all across the research studies is that being a victim of weight stigma actually predicts weight gain, not weight loss. I want y'all to absorb that. This is important. What she's also found, and you all saw from the previous slide, I am a scientist and I am a feminist, and so I've written about this kind of stuff from both of those perspectives. And interestingly, the feminists and the scientists, when it comes to this type of research, they oftentimes disagree with one another. There's a lot of tension between them, and I find that tension to be really interesting, and I've tried to hold that tension in my own mind and in my own work and my own writing, and I've tried to reconcile that. But as a feminist, the thing that especially disturbs me is it is one thing in US culture to be a fat man. If you are a fat man, people recognize that you are a fat man, but they pay attention to what those men can do, what they do professionally, what they can do interpersonally in their relationships. They still pay attention to what the men can do. If you are a fat woman in US culture, people pay attention to your body. And they are oftentimes stigmatizing her because of her body. It doesn't matter what she does, doesn't matter what she's capable of, she is going to be stigmatized and shamed and experience discrimination because of her body. So that, to me, is a feminist issue, that the way fat men are treated and the way fat women are treated are very different. And we see this discrimination, some of Rebecca Pohl's work, across all areas of life. We see this across education. We see this across healthcare. We see this across employment. Fat people are a lot less likely to be employed, promoted, make more money, that kind of thing. We see this everywhere in US culture. And so women are twice as likely to be discriminated because of their weight because of men. And 40% of total adults are going to experience discrimination due to their weight. Weight stigma is being a victim of weight stigma is related to poor health. And I want you all to absorb this. This is really important. It's not because weight stigma is associated with being a larger body size and that larger body size is necessarily related to poor health. It is actually that stigma, being a large person and feeling that weight stigma, that is associated with poor health completely independently of one's actual body size. So it's one thing to be a person with a large body size. It is a whole other thing to be a person of a large body size and feel like you are being discriminated against from other people in our culture. So weight stigma is psychologically toxic for people. If we look at the causality controversy, and this is Bloom's criteria for causality, you remember we went through this in epidemiology, we have been through this in the smoking literature. This is where it gets really interesting in the scientific literature because we just don't meet the causality criteria when it comes to looking at how larger body sizes are associated with poor health. We don't get the causality criteria assumption met. We've got some inconsistencies in the literature. The strength of the association, there is an association between larger body sizes. Remember that J-shaped curve once you get up to 30 and 40 in terms of body mass index. We do see some association, but the stronger association, I want you all to absorb this, it's very important. The stronger association is between sedentary lifestyle and poor health. Remember, flip that, we've talked about the fountain of youth is physical activity and getting exercise for people in the United States. So the particularly lethal, dangerous combination here, I really want you all to get this. It's not obesity that causes poor health. If you put obesity along with sedentary lifestyle, and keep in mind, sedentary lifestyle certainly can contribute to weight gain and obesity, but not everybody who's sedentary. There are lean people out there who are sedentary. That's not good for their health either. Obesity and sedentary lifestyle, that's the thing that's dangerous. So when we start looking at strength of associations, that's the kind of thing that we find to be more dangerous. Specificity, we do not have the specificity. The temporal association would be, are people of larger body size before they have problems with their health. We get that to some degree, but again, that's really a relationship about sedentary lifestyle. I need to take a drink. All right, on a biological plausibility level, we see some of this danger between levels of body fat and association with poor health. But I want to go back to that android, and I want to go back to that visceral fat, because if your body genetically stores extra weight and you have gained extra weight and it stores that inside the abdomen, not outside the skin, that's the one that is the most dangerous. And then the whole android shape, that is more dangerous than the gynoid shape. The coherence, that would be the dose response kind of thing. Again, I draw your attention back to that J-shaped curve. And then I want to talk a little bit about prevention trials, because here is where we really struggle with the scientific data. Prevention trials would be, imagine we've got these groups of people where they got to a certain level of morbid obesity, and like half of them, let's say, randomly assigned, they don't get these interventions and they continue to be at that very large body size. And then let's say the other half, they get this magical intervention that helps them lose weight and all the way down to normal weight, and they are able to keep that weight off. Then what we would do is we would compare these groups. And when we take a look at the health risks for both of these groups, and if the people who had lost weight down to normal weight, who had kept it off, if they were a lot healthier than these people who remain much larger, then we would have prevention trial data. And we could say that on this criterion of causality that we have met this. Problem is, other than the National Weight Registry that I'll talk about here in a little bit, we have not met this criterion. We do not have this data, which kind of speaks, going back to fat acceptance movement, going back to health at every size. It is really hard for people with these much larger body sizes to lose weight and keep that weight off. And we'll talk about why that is here in a bit. All right, we're going to talk evolution. Etiology means cause. Okay, and so here we're going to take a look at what are the known scientific factors that cause weight gain and cause obesity. If we look at the heritability index, we find that there is a lot of genetic risk for obesity. And one of the things I want to back up in terms of evolution, I want to talk about, is that all across human ancestry, all across our evolution, the problem has been, we talked about this in the nutrition lecture, the problem has been lack of food and famine, food scarcity, famine, and starvation. People starving to death before they could live their lives, people starving to death before they could reproduce and raise their children. All across the world, famine was a much bigger challenge in evolution. Therefore, doesn't it make sense that we human beings have evolved all over the world, and that whatever genetic mutation a person developed that made it easier for them to survive on less food, made it easier for them. The reason why we store body fat, people, is because it is an evolutionary adaptation to a starvation. If we've got the ability to store energy in our bodies in the terms of fat, then if we are starving, we burn our own fat, and we're a lot more likely to survive a famine period by burning our own fat than if we were lean and we didn't have much body fat. So it makes a lot of sense that there's not one gene that creates obesity. There are lots of genes, and scientists who study genetics have been able to determine that our heritability of our body size is somewhere between 30 and 80%. And we know there are 97 loci identified that predict our body mass index. So lots of genes. And there are 49 known loci that have been identified that determine our waist to hip ratio. So multifactorial genes, that makes a lot of sense when you think about human evolution all across the world. There's research also, I want to talk about Plomin's research. Developmental psychologists love Plomin and some of the work that he has done. He has studied identical twins who were given up for adoption and raised in separate environments. Now, keep in mind nowadays, foster parents and adoption agencies all across the world, they keep twins together. They try to keep siblings together. They try to keep twins together. They tend not to separate. But back in the day when Plomin began his research, identical twins could be put in two separate families, and then he finds them later on in life. And he found that identical twins reared apart, the correlation between their body mass indices, their body sizes, was correlation rho equals 0.74. To determine how much variance that is, you take 7 times 7, and that's 49. 50%, about 50% of the prediction of this overweight for these two people that genetically were alike was shared by their genetics, which means 50% of the prediction of their body sizes was their environment, the environment of the families that they were placed in. Some other twin studies that have been done show that the heritability is somewhere between 40 and 70%. We know that this is studied in animal models with these OB mice, these OB mice that have a tendency to become obese, and they also have a tendency to develop type 2 diabetes. And so one way I think about that is that if we think about US environment, the most common, we're going to call this default environments here in a bit. The most common environment for people living in the United States is sedentary lifestyle. Most people have an abundance of food availability, and then abundance of food availability that is very high in energy. So take fast food for an example. If you take the people that have these multiple genes or some of these multiple genes and you place those individuals, you insert those genes, that genotype, into the common US environment, then the phenotype, the expression of those genes, it's no wonder that we are seeing across US history, considering the environmental changes for human beings across US history, it's no wonder that we are seeing more individuals with obesity in the United States. So thinking about most people that had that genetic type are going to end up obese given this environment. Now, I want to talk about the National Weight Registry, because remember we talked about prevention trials. We're not very good at that. We haven't seen enough of that. The National Weight Registry is, I think this was started by Rena Wing and some of the researchers up at the University of Pittsburgh. What they have been studying, it's kind of like Prochaska and DiClemente. Remember, they studied the smokers who would quit on their own, and by doing so, they learned what were the processes in helping people to quit smoking. What the National Weight Registry has done, it's found people out there who had larger bodies, who lost a significant amount of weight. And what they have done is they have studied these individuals. And one of the things that they have found, and I really want you all to absorb this, this is important, that these people who had lost a significant amount of weight and kept it off, they are a rare breed of people. Most individuals who lose a significant amount of weight, they don't keep it off. They end up regaining that weight. It is really susceptible to people after weight loss to regain weight because metabolic rate decreases. Okay, it harms the natural normal amount of kilocalories. It's called our basal metabolic rate, the normal number of kilocalories that we burn a day just to live, to our body to heal itself. We burn calories even in our sleep. So basal metabolic rate, that lowers in people who lose weight. And then that makes it easier for people to regain weight. If you need less calories a day, it's easier to gain weight than if you need a ton of calories a day. These individuals who had lost weight and kept it off, if you compare them in their body sizes, lost weight and kept it off, to people who've always been at that body size, and you look at their basal metabolic rate, the people who had lost weight and kept it off, their basal metabolic rate is significantly lower than people who are at that body size but have stabilized there, to the tune of negative 800 kilocalories a day. So I want us to have some appreciation for that. I don't know about you all, but I would not want to be depriving myself every single day of the pleasure of food of 800 kilocalories a day. That would be deprivation to me. But that's what it takes for these people. I want us to have some understanding and some sympathy and empathy for them, that to be able to lose weight and maintain that weight loss, they usually have to stay physically active. That's predictive. But they really have to continue dieting. They really have to continue with food restriction in order for that weight loss to maintain. So I want us to understand that. It is hard for people. There's also, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there's a lot of scientists researching the sort of the biology of what's going on in our gut and our biome in there, in terms of hormones and how people digest food and how those chemicals communicate. There's a lot of neurotransmitter research on hunger and satiety going on in science too. It's not my area of research. I'm not going to go into detail about that. All right, I'm going to wrap up this lecture right now. And so this is the end of part 1 of the obesity lecture. I'm going to end this meeting and I will be back with part 2. Y'all take care out there. See ya.